In the first 6 months of 2025, the United States dollar collapsed by approximately 10.8% against major global currencies. This is not a standard market fluctuation. It is a statistical anomaly, representing the worst start to a year for the greenback since 1973, the era when the gold standard was finally buried. Most financial analysts look at these charts and see an accident, but they are looking at the wrong data. This is not a crisis of incompetence. It is a crisis of intent. History teaches us a brutal lesson. Empires rarely collapse solely due to external invasion. They crumble when the state makes the fatal decision to sacrifice the currency, to pay for the sins of the past. Today that decision has been made. While the world watches the volatility with confusion, a calculated blueprint is being executed from the highest levels of the U.S. Treasury. Scott Bessent and chief economic strategist Stephen Miran have openly discussed a strategy designed to deliberately weaken the dollar. They are calling it the Mar-a-Lago Accord, a modern, aggressive resurrection of the 1985 Plaza Accord. The official narrative is that this devaluation is necessary to resurrect American manufacturing. But the mathematical reality suggests a much darker motive. This is a silent default on nearly $38 trillion in gross sovereign debt. By engineering a crash in purchasing power, Washington is attempting to erase the real value of its obligations without technically declaring bankruptcy. We are witnessing the most dangerous high-wire act in modern financial history. The question is no longer if the dollar will crash, but how far the elite will let it fall to save the system. Is this a brilliant economic rebirth, or the managed demolition of the global reserve currency? To understand the gravity of the present, we must first look at the charts that most economists are ignoring. The data confirms a seismic shift. The US dollar has fallen more than 10% in the first half of 2025 alone, specifically 10.8%. This is not merely a correction or a standard market fluctuation. It represents the worst start to a year for the dollar since 1973. The year 1973 is not a random benchmark. It was a period of monetary chaos that redefined the global order, marked by the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the onset of inflationary shocks. Today we are witnessing a similar fracture. However, unlike the chaotic unraveling of the 1970s, the current crash is not a result of external forces overwhelming the system. The volatility we see on the screens is not an error. It is a feature. Mainstream financial media frames this drop as a market accident, a reaction to interest rate speculation or temporary instability. This is a comforting lie. The reality hidden in plain sight is that this is a deliberate plan. The current administration is not reacting to a weak dollar. They are engineering it. The architects of this strategy, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chief Economic Advisor Stephen Miran, have been openly discussing a strategy to deliberately weaken the dollar to bring back manufacturing. They have given this blueprint a name, the Mar-a-Lago Accord. The name itself is a direct nod to history, designed to evoke the memory of the 1985 Plaza Accord. 40 years ago, the G5 nations met at the Plaza Hotel in New York to coordinate an intervention that successfully drove down the dollar by 40%. But where the Plaza Accord was a multilateral agreement between allies, the Mar-a-Lago Accord is a unilateral weapon. The strategy proposed by Miran uses tariffs as leverage to force trading partners like Europe, China, and Japan to accept a weaker dollar. It is a diplomatic ultimatum. Countries that do not cooperate face punitive tariffs, while those that do receive relief. It is currency manipulation masked as trade policy, a smile backed by a threat. But why would a government intentionally destroy the purchasing power of its own currency? The official logic is seductive in its simplicity. The administration argues that a persistent overvaluation of the dollar is the root cause of economic imbalances. By crushing the dollar's value, they aim to make American exports cheaper and imports more expensive, theoretically powering a manufacturing boom. They are telling the American public that making their money worth less is actually for their own good. To execute a maneuver this dangerous, you do not hire a bureaucrat, you hire a predator. This brings us to the man controlling the levers, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Bessent is not a traditional academic economist. He is a former hedge fund manager who famously worked with George Soros. This detail is critical. Soros is the man known for breaking the Bank of England in 1992 by betting against the British pound. Bessent comes from a world where currencies are not static stores of value, but assets to be attacked, leveraged, and broken for profit. In January 2024, Bessent wrote explicitly that weakening the dollar early in his second administration would make U.S. manufacturing competitive. He outlined a vision where a weak dollar and cheap energy would fuel an economic boom. Yet he understands the game of public perception. In public testimony, when pressed by the markets, Bessent stated we have a strong dollar policy. Note the careful phrasing. He claims to have a policy of a strong dollar, not that he wants a strong dollar now. It is a classic misdirection. While the Treasury Secretary calms the markets with platitudes, the machinery of the state is hard at work driving the currency lower. The anomaly of 2025 is not that the dollar is crashing. The anomaly is that the crash is being steered from inside the Treasury. We are watching a government actively working to devalue the wealth of its citizens under the guise of industrial renewal. But as we peel back the layers of this strategy, we find that manufacturing is only the surface-level justification. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is not just about factories, it is about the debt. And to understand the endgame, we must look at the blueprint they are copying and the devastating side effects they are ignoring. To decode the current collapse, we must stop looking at market charts and start reading the policy papers that the mainstream press largely ignored. The intellectual architecture of this crash was not drafted in a panic room during a crisis. It was published openly in November 2024. The document is titled A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System, authored by Stephen Miran, Trump's choice for chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. This paper is the smoking gun. It is not a theoretical exercise. It is an operating manual for economic warfare. In this manifesto, Miran argues that the fundamental rot at the core of the American economy, the trade deficits, the hollowed-out industrial base, the debt, stems from a single source, the persistent overvaluation of the US dollar. He explicitly challenges the Wall Street consensus that exchange rates are forces of nature beyond government control. Miran asserts that the belief that there are no tools available to unilaterally address the current misvaluation is false. The tool they have chosen is the Mar-a-Lago Accord. Unlike the diplomatic negotiations of the 1980s, this modern iteration does not rely on mutual agreement or international goodwill. It relies on brute force. The administration plans to weaponize tariffs, transforming them from simple trade barriers into complex instruments of currency manipulation. The strategy is brutally simple. The United States will use tariffs as leverage to force major trading partners, specifically Europe, China, and Japan, to accept a weaker dollar. The mechanism works like a vice. If a country refuses to allow its currency to appreciate against the dollar, it faces punitive tariffs that destroy its access to the American market. If it cooperates and allows the dollar to devalue, it receives tariff relief. It is, as observers have noted, currency manipulation with a smile and a threat. The administration is effectively outsourcing the destruction of the dollar to its rivals, forcing them to participate in the devaluation of their own foreign reserves. The public justification for this aggression is manufacturing. The narrative sold to the voter is that a cheaper dollar is the magic bullet that will reopen factories in the Rust Belt. Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent wrote as early as January 2024 that weakening the dollar early in the administration would make U.S. manufacturing competitive. They argue that a weak dollar combined with plentiful cheap energy could power a new industrial boom. But this manufacturing narrative serves another purpose. It is a smokescreen. It provides a patriotic cover for a policy that erodes the wealth of every American saver. While the cameras focus on the promise of new jobs, the machinery of the state is actively diluting the currency those jobs will pay in. This brings us to the most sophisticated element of the blueprint, the lie. A controlled crash requires maintaining confidence while destroying value. If the Treasury Secretary were to walk out to a podium and announce, "We are crashing the dollar," the result would not be a managed decline. It would be a chaotic rout that could collapse the bond market. To prevent this, Bessent walks a rhetorical tightrope. In public testimony, when directly questioned about the administration's intent, Bessent stated no one should listen to anyone in the markets talk about the US dollar, other than President Trump or myself. He followed this with a masterclass in doublespeak, saying we have a strong dollar policy. Note the precision of the language. He did not say he wants a strong dollar today. He did not say he will intervene to support the dollar. He said they have a policy. In the dialect of central banking, this phrase has become meaningless, a hollow ritual designed to soothe algorithmic traders, while the real work of devaluation continues in the background. It is a necessary deception. They need the dollar to die a slow death, not a sudden one. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is not just a trade strategy. It is a rejection of the free market in favor of managed outcomes. They are attempting to reverse engineer the economic model of their rivals. But as we prepare to see if this gamble pays off, we must look backward. This has been tried before, and the last time the United States forced the world to swallow a 40% devaluation, the consequences were not a renaissance, but a catastrophe for the very allies who agreed to play along. To predict where the Mar-a-Lago Accord will take us, we do not need a crystal ball. We simply need to look back at the scene of the crime. The date was September 22, 1985. The location was the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The finance ministers of the G5, the United States, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK, gathered not for a celebration, but for an intervention. At the time, the American economic engine was stalling. Under Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, interest rates had been jacked up to crush inflation, causing the dollar to surge by 50% between 1980 and 1985. While this killed inflation, it also strangled American industry. The country lost 2 million manufacturing jobs in just 5 years, and the trade deficit ballooned to 3.4% of GDP. The strong dollar was an executioner for the Rust Belt. So the G5 agreed to a radical plan, a coordinated assault on the value of the US dollar. The intervention was brutally effective. In the 2 years following the agreement from 1985 to 1987, the dollar fell by 40%. The American trade deficit improved substantially, and by 1991, the current account had moved close to a surplus. On paper, it was a masterstroke of economic engineering. The U.S. had successfully exported its pain to its allies, but for one of those allies, the Plaza Accord was not a solution. It was a death sentence. This is the chapter of history that Washington ignores, but Tokyo remembers vividly. For Japan, the Plaza Accord became a cautionary tale of catastrophic proportions. As the dollar collapsed, the yen exploded in value. It appreciated dramatically from 242 yen per dollar in September 1985 to 153 just a year later, eventually strengthening to around 120 by 1988. This rapid appreciation threatened to destroy Japan's export-led economy. Panic set in at the Bank of Japan. To counteract the crushing weight of a strong yen, Japanese policymakers engaged in aggressive monetary stimulus. They slashed interest rates and flooded their economy with cheap money, desperate to keep their exporters alive. But that liquidity didn't go into factories. It went into speculation. This direct reaction to the Plaza Accord fueled the massive Japanese asset price bubble of the late 1980s. The Nikkei index screamed to record highs, and Tokyo real estate became more valuable than all of California. By 1989, the party ended. The bubble burst, triggering a crash that destroyed generations of wealth. It led to Japan's lost decades, an era of deflation, low growth, and economic stagnation that the country is still fighting today. The Plaza Accord saved American manufacturing in the 80s, but the price was the economic soul of Japan. However, there was another observer watching this tragedy unfold: China. Beijing studied the Plaza Accord and drew a very different conclusion. They realized that allowing your currency to float according to Western rules was suicide, so they decided to rig the game. Unlike the temporary coordination of 1985, China engaged in systematic long-term manipulation. Between 2001 and the early 2010s, China purchased more than $2.2 trillion, 0 cents in foreign exchange reserves, to artificially suppress the value of the yuan. Economists estimated that the yuan was undervalued by 40% or more relative to the dollar during this period. This acted as a massive 40% subsidy for Chinese exports and a 40% tax on imports from competitors. It was, as Paul Krugman noted, a predatory policy that reduced world GDP. The U.S. Treasury filed reports, and Congress threatened tariffs, but China ignored them all. By the time they finally allowed the yuan to strengthen in the 2010s, the deed was done. They had already built an unassailable manufacturing base. The lesson from history is stark. Currency manipulation works. China proved it can build an empire. The U.S. proved it can fix a deficit. But the mechanism is a double-edged sword. The U.S. is now attempting to pull off the same playbook in reverse. They want the benefits of the Chinese model without the fate of the Japanese model. But there is a moral to this story that no policymaker wants to admit openly. In a currency war, there is no such thing as a win-win. Value is not created, it is stolen. The Plaza Accord proved that you can save your industry by sacrificing your currency, but you might just kill your allies or yourself in the process. And while the goal today is to revive manufacturing, there is a much larger, darker beast lurking in the American ledger that makes the trade deficit look like a rounding error. This isn't just about factories anymore. It is about survival. We have discussed the trade deficits. We have analyzed the factories, but if you stop there, you are missing the forest for the trees. The weak dollar strategy is not merely an industrial policy designed to bring jobs back to the Rust Belt. That is the public sales pitch. The private reality is far more desperate. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is at its core a survival mechanism for a government drowning in its own obligations. To understand why, we must look at the number that keeps central bankers awake at night. $38 trillion, 0 cents. This is the approximate size of the United States national debt. But the absolute number is not the problem. The cost of that number is, we have entered a phase that economists like Lynn Alden call fiscal dominance. This is the point of no return. Fiscal dominance occurs when the national debt becomes so massive that it effectively handcuffs the Federal Reserve. In a normal economy, the Fed raises interest rates to fight inflation. But when you owe $38 trillion, 0 cents every tick upward in interest rates. But when you owe $38 trillion to the government's interest bill, the Fed can no longer act as an independent inflation fighter. It becomes a hostage to the Treasury's solvency. The math is terrifyingly simple. The U.S. government is now spending approximately $1 trillion, 0 cents per year, just on interest payments. Let that sink in. The United States now spends more on servicing its past debt than it spends on its entire defense budget. It spends more on interest than on Medicare. The government is essentially taking out new credit cards, just to pay the minimum monthly balance on the old ones. This is a mathematical death spiral. So how do you escape a debt trap that you cannot pay off and cannot default on without destroying the global financial system? You do not pay it, you erase it. This brings us to the stealth default. This is the hidden engine behind the Mar-a-Lago Accord. When Scott Bessent and Stephen Moran talk about weakening the dollar, they are describing a mechanism to liquidate the real value of the federal debt. It is a process called financial repression, or, more simply, inflating the debt away. Here's how the theft works. Imagine the government owes you $100, 0 cents. If they deliberately weaken the currency and allow inflation to run hot, say reducing the dollar's purchasing power by 22% over a few years, they still pay you back the same $100, 0 cents note. The face value has not changed. The contract has been honored. Technically, there is no default. But in reality, that $100, 0 cents now only buys $78, 0 cents worth of goods. The government has effectively wiped out $22 cents of its debt to you without ever appearing in bankruptcy court. They have transferred $22, their sense of purchasing power, from your pocket to the Treasury's balance sheet. It is a soft default disguised as monetary policy. The weak dollar, therefore, is not just about making American steel competitive again. It is about making American debt manageable again. It is the only mathematical way out of the trap. They cannot cut Social Security without political suicide. They cannot cut defense in a world on fire. And they cannot raise taxes enough to close a $2 trillion, 0-cents annual deficit. The only option left is to print, devalue, and inflate. But in every transfer of wealth, there is a winner and a loser. Who are the victims of this $38 trillion, 0-cents heist? The first victims are foreign creditors. Nations like China and Japan, who hold trillions in U.S. treasuries, are watching the value of their holdings evaporate. This is why they are dumping American debt. They know they are being paid back in funny money. But the second and most tragic victim is you. If you are a saver, if you hold cash, if your wealth is locked in a standard 401k or fixed income bonds, you are the collateral damage. Every percentage point the dollar drops is a direct tax on your life's work. You are paying for the government's X not through a tax bill sent to your mailbox, but through the grocery bill that is 20% higher, the house that is out of reach, and the retirement account that looks big on paper but buys less every year. They are solving the sovereign debt crisis by creating a cost of living crisis. The Mar-a-Lago Accord is not a free lunch. It is a margin call on the American middle class. And as we move to the final piece of this puzzle, we have to ask what happens if this controlled demolition gets out of control. Because historically, once you start the fire of devaluation, it rarely stays in the fireplace. We have examined the plan, the history, and the hidden motives. Now we must confront the fatal flaw in the Mar-a-Lago Accord. The entire strategy rests on a single seductive promise that crashing the dollar will bring manufacturing jobs back to American soil. It is a vision of the 1950s, a nostalgic portrait of steel mills and assembly lines employing millions of middle-class workers. But this is 2025, not 1985. The economic landscape has shifted beneath our feet, and there is a variable that Besant and Mirand are conveniently ignoring: the rise of the machines. The administration promises a manufacturing renaissance, but even if the factories return, the jobs will not. We are entering the age of lights-out manufacturing, facilities that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with zero human intervention. The industrial base of the future will not be built on union labor, it will be built on robotics and artificial intelligence. The strategy is attempting to solve a 21st century crisis with 20th century logic. By devaluing the dollar to incentivize domestic production, they may succeed in boosting GDP and corporate profits. But for the average worker, the result is a cruel paradox. You pay the price of a weaker currency, higher costs for everything you buy, but you never receive the benefit of the higher wages you were promised. The factories of the future will contribute to the tax base perhaps, but they will be automated ghosts, generating wealth for capital, not labor. And this leads us to the second existential threat, the reserve currency catch-22. The United States enjoys a privilege no other empire in history has held. It prints the world's money. This exorbitant privilege allows the U.S. to run massive deficits because the world has an insatiable appetite for dollars and treasury bonds. They buy them because they are safe, stable, and liquid. But the weak dollar strategy deliberately attacks that stability. Stephen Miron himself recognizes the contradiction. You cannot simultaneously be the world's safe haven and a currency that is being actively debased by its own government. If Washington explicitly declares that its policy is to make the dollar worth less, why would a central bank in Brazil, Saudi Arabia, or Singapore want to hold it? By weaponizing the dollar to fix the trade deficit, the administration risks destroying the dollar's superpower status. If foreign nations stop buying U.S. debt because they fear devaluation, interest rates will not just rise, they will explode. The cost of funding the $38 trillion 0-cents debt would become mathematically impossible, triggering the very collapse the strategy was designed to prevent. It is a geopolitical suicide pact. And while these high-level games are played in the corridors of power, the bill is already arriving at your kitchen table. We often hear the statistic that the U.S. dollar has lost 95% of its value over the last 100 years. That was a slow, imperceptible erosion, the boiling frog effect. What is happening now is the turning up of the heat. A 10.8% drop in 6 months is not a statistic. It is an immediate pay cut for every American consumer. The United States is an import-dependent empire. From the smartphone in your pocket, to the clothes on your back, to the coffee in your cup, it all comes from abroad. When the dollar crashes, the price of these goods does not just creep up, it spikes. Retailers will pass 100% of these currency costs to you. This is the consumer reality of the Mar-a-Lago Accord. You are trapped in a pincer movement. On one side, your savings are diluted by the stealth default. On the other side, your cost of living is driven up by the manufacturing tax. You are earning in a currency that buys less to pay for a transition that might never employ you. This culminates in the ultimate danger, stagflation. This is the scenario that keeps economists up at night. It is the High-Wire Act gone wrong. If the weak dollar drives up inflation, but the manufacturing boom fails to materialize, blocked by automation, red tape, or incompetence, you get the worst of both worlds. You get the soaring prices of the 1970s combined with the stagnant growth of the 2000s. It is inflation without the growth. It is pain without the gain. The administration is betting the house that they can thread the needle, that they can devalue the currency just enough to help industry, but not enough to kill the bond market. That they can spark inflation just enough to melt the debt, but not enough to spark a revolution. It is a gamble of breathtaking arrogance. As we stand on the edge of this economic experiment, the warning lights are flashing red. The strategy is in motion. The dollar is falling. The plan to erase $38 trillion, 0 cents, is live. But as history shows, once you open the Pandora's box of currency devaluation, you cannot simply close it when you have had enough. The mechanism has been triggered. The only question left is who pays the final price when the smoke clears. So let's be absolutely clear about the endgame. The $38 trillion, 0 cents debt is not going away. It is not vanishing into the ether. In physics, energy is neither created nor destroyed. It merely changes form. In economics, debt does not simply disappear, it is transferred. What we are witnessing is the largest wealth transfer in American history. It is a migration of value not from the government to the void, but from your hard-earned savings directly to the balance sheet of the U.S. Treasury. Every percentage point of inflation is a silent tax. Every drop in the dollar is a confiscation of your purchasing power. This is not a policy error, it is a deliberate liquidation. History is littered with the wreckage of empires that tried to print their way out of decline. From the coin clipping of Rome to the chaotic devaluations of the 20th century, the story is always the same. The state plays with fire to save itself, but it is the citizens, the savers, the workers, the pensioners who eventually get burned. We cannot say we were not warned. The architects of this plan did not hide it in a secret vault. They published the playbook. They gave the interviews. They told us exactly what was coming. The experiment is no longer theoretical. It is underway. The only remaining question is not whether the dollar will fall, but whether you are prepared to pay the price for their survival.